Hi everyone, my name is Miss Stewart and I'm your new humanities teacher. I'm looking forward to getting to know you all. You'll see that I have a very open teaching style and that I like to walk around the room as I'm teaching because I like to connect with you. I also want you to know that you are the drivers in my classroom. What does that mean? It means I like to have an invitational classroom where your opinion matters very much to me. I encourage you to share your thoughts, your opinions, regardless of whether they agree with mine or are different. Because as you'll see, my opinion is just one amongst many. And all I ask of you is that when you share your opinion, that you always be able to justify it. You see, you are now young adults, and I want you to develop independence in critical thinking, which includes questioning me, researching, analysing, evaluating, and reflecting on the work we cover. As we progress through the course, I want you to apply these skills to investigate events that are happening out in society, in the world, developments in the global economy, issues and phenomena, both historical and contemporary. For example, who would have thought that something like COVID-19 would dramatically impact on government decision, but also on the personal choices that you and I made? And that really impacted on the issue that we are looking at today, which is livability. Before I start talking to you about livability, I just want to remind you about the posters that are around the classroom. I call these posters the 5 W's, and they are the W questions. I always want you to be asking what, why, whom, where, and when. In other words, I want you to be curious learners, and I want you to question everything. You'll also see that I tend to teach from a real world perspective, where I will draw on current events that are happening in the economy, nationally and globally, also from the business sector, the economy, because I want you to understand how this actually applies in a real world context. As you know, this term we were looking at business and economics, but I'm also going to pull on some of the concepts that we've previously studied from civics and citizenship, even from geography and history, so that you can actually see how all this interconnects, so that you can actually make informed decisions and understand what drives your decisions. Today, as I said, we are looking at livability. What does that mean to you? What factors do you consider are important when deciding where you live? Obviously, right now, most of you live where you live because that's probably the home you were born into. It's obviously where your parents live. But why did your parents choose that particular suburb? Why did they choose that particular house? Have you ever asked your parents why they've chosen to live in the suburb they're living in? Why they've chosen to live in a house or a unit, or it might be a villa? What factors were important to them in making that decision? Was it access to schools? Was it access to the train line that's not far from here? Was it access to wonderful parks and the river? What other factors influenced your parents in deciding where they live? Australia has a very mobile population. That simply means that we tend to move quite regularly. We're not tend to stay in the same area. Whereas where I was born in Malta, people tend to live in the same suburb they were born their entire lives. But it's not unusual for Australians to travel and to relocate for work or for family or for other reasons. And we're going to explore some of those reasons today. Livability is something that is important not just to individuals in deciding where they live, but it's also something that the government needs to take into account. As you know, one of the main economic objectives of government is to improve living standards. And to do this, they need to consider key indicators such as gross domestic product, the unemployment rate, the inflation rate, what's happening internationally, for example, the American elections. All of that needs to be factored in when governments are making decisions. Then when you throw in the curveball of a serious housing shortage that is currently happening all over Australia, this becomes even more of a priority for the government. We've previously looked at the economic problem. Would someone like to remind me what that means? Thank you, Amanda. That was an excellent answer. You're correct. The economic problem is a dual problem of scarcity and choice. So when making decisions, consumers, businesses, and government must compare the costs and benefits of using their limited resources. This cost-benefit framework is the basis for all decision-making in economics and business, but it's also the basis for decision-making for you and I. You have probably heard your parents expressing concerns about high interest rates, the cost of living, particularly electricity and petrol, and fresh produce. Would anyone like to share some of the conversations you might have overheard or been part of in relation to the high costs of living? Have you found your parents telling you to do things like turn the power off, have shorter showers because of the cost of electricity? Anyone like to share? Okay. I know, for example, myself, my main protein source is eggs, but when you've got to pay $10.90 for a dozen eggs, it really makes you think about, do you want to spend your money on eggs? Because I know I could spend $10.90 in lots of other more pleasurable ways. In other words, it's the economic problem. Before I go too much further, I'd like you to just turn to the person next to you, and I want you to talk to them about why you live where you live. And I want you to go a little bit further and talk about whether you would likely stay there when you finish school and university if you're going on to uni. That is, when you're a young adult, do you imagine yourself staying in the same suburb that you currently live? And what factors will you take into account in making that decision? Will it be access to things like gyms, shopping centres, doctors, transport, universities? Spend a few minutes chatting, and then I'm going to choose 2 pairs to feed back to the class as to why you have made the choice you've made. As you do that, I'm just going to walk around and spy on you, I guess, and listen to what you're saying, because I'm really curious as to why you choose those areas to live. Thank you. Okay, guys, you've had your 5 minutes, so coming back and we're getting some feedback. So then I would run this little activity and discuss the student answers. So to help you understand this concept of livability, I'm going to share my own personal story. When I met you yesterday, I explained to you that I had just relocated from Queensland to WA. I've lived in Queensland my entire life since I came to Australia. So when my parents migrated to Australia, they chose Queensland as their place to live for various reasons. So I've spent my entire adult life and most of my childhood living in Brisbane and the Gold Coast. And both areas were lovely, and I got a lot of enjoyment out of the areas. But there were 2 factors that, as I've got older, have impacted on my enjoyment of those areas. In other words, they've impacted on the livability of those areas. And those 2 factors were family connection and climate. You see, as I've grown older, yes, I'm 100 years old, the humidity and climate for Queensland has become a factor, and I'm just finding I can't really bear the climate anymore. It's hard to enjoy a lot of activities in summer. I find that I don't want to exercise. Even normally pleasant activities like sitting down and reading a book isn't pleasant in Queensland summers. The reality is a 40-degree summer in Perth is more pleasurable than a 30-degree summer in Brisbane because of the humidity. The other thing I've really missed in Queensland is the lack of colour. Because of the climate, it's very hard to grow beautiful flowers, and the things that tend to thrive tend to be natives. And I tell you what, I really love seeing all the lovely wildflowers in Perth, particularly at Kings Park, and all the beautiful wisteria that is growing in people's gardens. So what is livability? As you're starting to see, there are many factors that need to be taken into account in deciding where you should live. And those factors are going to be different state to state, nationally, and of course globally. You may recall that Western Australia had very strict border closures during COVID, and that meant that pretty much for everyone living in Western Australia, COVID didn't really impact on you other than for travel reasons. Whereas in Queensland, COVID really impacted on our livability because we had a lot of border closures. We had a lot of orders where we weren't allowed to leave our homes. We could only travel within a 5-kilometre radius. Face masks were compulsory a lot of the time. So it made it very difficult to really thrive, and life wasn't quite as enjoyable. So if you think back to those border closures in WA, it really meant that you guys could go on living your life as normally as possible, with the exception of travelling interstate and travelling overseas. In other words, Western Australia stayed very livable during COVID. So when I decided to move to Western Australia, it was largely because of the climate and, as I said, family connection. I had to really do a lot of research because the reality is I knew nothing about Perth. I didn't know what suburbs were nice suburbs or what suburbs offered particular recreational activities. So I had to do some research, and to facilitate that, I came over to Western Australia 3 times in the last year, and I made it a priority that I needed to come in your summer and I needed to come in your winter. Now, if you think about why was I making the decision to leave Queensland? That's right, Amanda, I said it was climate and family. So I needed to come to Perth during both of your extreme seasons, so summer and winter, because I'd heard that your winters were really cold and your summers were really hot. Well, I found your summers very pleasant. Yes, they're hot, but it's a dry heat, and that's a lot more bearable than humid heat. And your winters are absolutely beautiful. You know, you can go out in the afternoon and have a walk. It's just lovely. But I did a lot of other research as well. You know, I researched things like crime rates. I researched unemployment, the cost of living. I found that the crime rates were very similar in the suburbs I was looking at to where I was currently living at that time in Queensland. The unemployment rate was very similar. In fact, what I actually found was that Western Australia has a chronic teaching shortage, so I felt quite comfortable that I wouldn't have a problem in trying to get a job. So that was one factor that was actually in my favour. I also found the cost of housing slightly cheaper than Brisbane. So Western Australia had a lot of factors that was making things more accessible to me and certainly giving me the ability to increase my livability. If you think back to earlier in the year, we looked at the federal budget, and it was quite unusual this year because in the federal budget, Australia's GST distribution was increased to WA by just over $6 billion. Okay, that's a lot of extra revenue that WA has now received. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to get into groups of 3 to 4, and I want you to project manage how that money should be spent. But I'm going to make your focus quite narrow. I just want you to look at housing affordability. So that's going to encompass 2 things. We've got a housing shortage and we've got a lack of a housing that is affordable. Because what we're seeing for the first time in Australia is homelessness is actually hitting everybody. It's not just the stereotype that we've had in the past where it's been predominantly older men. Homelessness now is also hitting women and it's hitting families. So let's pretend that you work for the Treasury in WA and you're trying to work out how we could use some of this money to make housing, the housing crisis, a little bit more manageable. So focusing on affordability and the housing shortage. So you might consider about building more housing, social housing, but also should there be policies put in place in relation to housing affordability? I'm going to give you about 10 to 15 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back and feedback to the class. Thanks, guys.